This story begins with a group of carriages heading somewhere. The little girl in the carriage asked the man to look at her, asking if he was 12 years old because she was 2, questioning who would be the younger sibling. For the boy, it didn't matter, and if she wanted, she could be older one. So the little girl murmurs that it was very tedious. The boy, in turn, says that she could then be the younger sister, but she asks when she said she wanted to be the younger one, because the most important thing from now on was that they would be a family. Leaving the boy surprised by the girl's words, thinking that now he was becoming a family with strangers, but he also had a family before. His name is Boris Jaimin, the second son of Jurkin Jaimin, the lord of the Longroad Travaches. 12 years ago, at the Jaimin residence, a funeral was taking place, and a man welcomes the protagonist, saying it was a shame that only he was by his side that night. As he could see, his family was highly recognized in the martial arts world, and he was sure that he would grow up to be a brave warrior who would inherit the armor and sword passed down by the family. The treasures called Winterer and Snowguard his brother would have to share with him, mentioning that the lady of the house had passed away and the young master might hate the next children. But Yevgen was very kind and sure he would give love and affection. So Boris had to survive in that nation where countless people die from revolutions every day. His uncle had been excluded from the family and now dreamed of the day he could take revenge, so they could lose their lives at any moment because of that revolution. Even if a bloodbath happened in his family or if someone went after the treasure, he should not worry. A survivor among them would definitely seek revenge. The Jaimins should never forget love and kindness. Boris was the one who should survive until the end of this painful world, because he was the chosen one. Returning to the protagonist, a maid says there was a spirit in Lake Emera, and no matter what happened, he should never go near that lake. That place was visible from the property at night, especially during stormy nights. His eyes glowed in the dark, feeding on those who dared to approach. For this reason, he should never go to that lake. The next day, the protagonist tells the other man what the maid had said. The man says he need not worry about that, because he was there to protect him. That was Yevgen, the eldest son of the Jaimin family. Noticing his brother's smile was brighter, he wonders why it seems something was out of place. Getting up, his brother says it was time to practice. Grabbing a sword, the boy begins to practice fencing. Yevgen says he should make sure to be within range because he was swinging the sword too far, mentioning that his form wasn't bad while continuing to train the boy. The protagonist advancing towards his brother ends up falling. Meanwhile, 2 people were watching the 2 brothers, and the man says Yevgen liked his younger brother. However, that man seemed not to like that, saying it was pathetic for someone who would be the heir to the family. That was Jurkin Jaimin, the head of the Jaimin family. Noticing something, the man seemed to be on alert. Meanwhile, the 2 brothers continued to train, and the protagonist thinks that feeling still continued, wondering why it was happening. Then Yevgen accidentally hits the boy, who starts apologizing. The protagonist, in turn, thinks it was the first time he had felt the sensation of someone trying to kill him, right after the boy faints. Another man appears saying that it was urgent, and they should not return to the family home. Because Vlado Jaimin had returned, for the protagonist, that strange feeling could not be controlled. Sometimes it became active, turning into a form of foreboding. Meanwhile, a man was arguing with the dog, asking if he had forgotten his master after so long. In the family's office, one of the servants calls the head, asking if he should let him in. Allowing the man, he soon enters the room, saying it had been a long time. That was Vlado Jaimin, the younger brother of Jurkin. Continuing, the head says it had been a long time since he had expelled him and was surprised to see that he was alive, thinking he didn't know why his brother had returned, and if he had gone there to die. Looking around, the man says nothing had changed in that place, and the only difference was that things seemed older, asking to offer a drink because he arrived early in the morning to have a conversation with him. Sitting at the table, the 2 begin to drink. The man asks if he remembered when they were young. In the Longroad field, they trained fencing, where he even recalled the comfort of their swords. At that time, they skipped training to play in the hills, but he ended up being reprimanded by their father for not behaving like an older son. The head, in turn, asks what he wanted. The other man says he was very impatient, mentioning that Prince Kong was after him and would become the elected head in the elections this time. When that happens, those on the other prince's side will be enemies. The reason he had returned was to ensure his family's survival, but for the head, if that was all, he should leave the mansion. Then the man says that the mansion didn't entirely belong to him, because their parents passed it on to both of them. The head asks if he had forgotten what he had done. Because of him, their sister had died. Then the man tells him to think carefully, and if that was his fault. Continuing to speak, the head says that if it weren't for his dirty schemes, she would still be alive with her fiancé. But for the man, that fiancé was a madman who had killed his own wife. The head, in turn, throws a drink in the man's face, asking if he dared to give such an excuse in front of him. Then the man says that even after all this time, he was still the same way. The people of Travaches are very stubborn, dividing into many factions. Questioning if he thought his children would be different in that house. Saying that this was his last chance. Since they were brothers, he decided to go there to forgive all his mistakes, and the elected head Khan would also turn a blind eye to the things he had done. The only thing he needed to do was leave the mansion. The head says that even if he were killed, he wouldn't give him anything. Then the man starts to leave the room, saying they would see how long that would last. Looking out the window, the head of the family tells one of the servants to start the preparations, because it was time to resist. Returning to the protagonist along with his brother, he asks where their father was opening the door. His brother says it was time to use the winter kit, an armor to assassinate the territorial lord of another country, the snow guard, and the sword obtained by killing enemies in 30 years. The winter, a treasure of the Jaemin family passed through generations, a winter equipment that only the strongest warrior could possess. As the centuries passed, these equipments only remained as rumors, but now they go into the hands of their master as equipment. A flashback at the beginning of the year appears with their father showing something to Yevgen. Meanwhile, the protagonist observes them talking about the family treasure that his great-grandfather and his son obtained by defeating countless enemies. The Winterer and the Snow Guard, together they were called the Winter Kit. Yevgen is surprised as the rumors about it were true, and the head says that if even he didn't know about it, then the silence had been effective. His grandfather had passed a person to Vlado and to him in the hope of working together. However, he was wrong. The Snow Kit only showed its true power when used together. As it would be 20 years, he should learn his role as the heir to the family. And if something happened to the family, he should flee with the Winter Kit. No matter what happened, he should survive protecting the family's heritage, because his family would survive through him, and he should not lose it no matter what happened. Meanwhile, the protagonist listened to everything in the background. The sword called Winterer and the winter armor were the family's last treasure. Boris, looking at the sword and armor, says that they were very cool, and his brother asks which one he thought was better. The protagonist in turn mentions that the armor should be heavy, so the sword would be better. Then his brother takes the sword, giving it to his brother, saying he would give it to him when he was old enough to wield one. Trying to hold the sword, it was still too heavy for the boy, and his brother says that now that was his sword. Since that day, his brother always said the same thing many times, and perhaps because of his reminder, he started to think that the sword was really his. However, he was just a child compared to his brother. This sword should be his, and there was no way it could belong to him. His brother mentions that their uncle had started a rebellion, and their father had foreseen everything, saying they should do what they had planned. There was a time when Butler Tulk spoke to the protagonist about rebellions. A rebellion that happened within the family only had winners and losers where they had no right or wrong side. And even with so many deaths, there would be no punishment. Since Boris was also a member of the Traviches, he would understand when the time was right. Returning to Yevgen, the boy says he would borrow the sword. Then Boris says he didn't need to return the sword because it was his brother's, because their father had given it to him. However, his brother was already convinced that the sword was no longer his, saying he would return it when the rebellion was over. Although the sword was heavy now, he shouldn't worry so much about it, and in the future, he would truly be able to handle it. Hugging the boy, Yevgen says he was a warrior. Looking out the window, a flash of light appears. Then his brother says it was starting. Outside the mansion, an army of soldiers marched, saying to serve the new master and help revive the Jaemin family. The head, looking at that turmoil, thinks that although it couldn't be compared to the time when his father was there, he still had the Jaemin soldiers who swore loyalty to the family. On the mansion's balcony, the head starts shouting if they dare to invade Longard. The soldiers, noticing the head, ask if he would hide like a coward. Then the other man makes a magic circle using a skill. Observing that magic, the soldiers question if it was fire, giving the order to kill that traitor. The soldiers on the other side are intimidated because the other army had a mage. The head, in turn, says that the Jaemin family would never fall for such a trick. At that moment, he is surprised, wondering what that thing was, because a kind of giant snake was in front of his army. That was a summoning from the frozen kingdom called Krygel. Observing the troops, he notices that the archmage named Jong was there, not believing that Chan had assigned Jong to Vlado. Right after, everyone starts evacuating the mansion. That creature begins to attack the mansion. The head thinks that evacuating the house was his priority while the second squad held off the attack. They needed to get out as quickly as possible and devise a plan. Looking back, he notices Yevgen and his brother, starting to argue with the boy about who would stay with Boris, asking how he would get out of there with a child, and if he didn't know what he was protecting now. Quickly, the two separate. The protagonist thinks his father was right and it would be impossible to escape with a child. Remembering his father's words, he assumes that his brother should survive in his place, because if it were him who survived, he wouldn't be able to protect the family. However, that strange feeling continued, a foreboding that something would happen to Yevgen. Outside the mansion, people were running desperately, and the army was still battling. The other man says to the head that all the people had evacuated. Looking back, they see the mansion was completely destroyed, leaving the head furious, questioning how Vlado dared to destroy it. As a family member, he would never forgive him, telling Tulk to check the status of the first and second squads. Tulk in turn mentions that they were at a disadvantage as expected and also couldn't use the mansion anymore. The head warns that they would attack the mansion's entrances, giving the order to split the remaining soldiers into two groups, hiding in the bushes waiting for his command. Boris asks how they would manage with that monster chasing them, but his father says it was okay as long as they didn't go to the mansion. That monster couldn't attack living beings and half of his body was in another world. Then the servant starts whistling, seeming to give a signal. Near the mansion, the head asks Boris to follow him and then retreat. When the fight started, he should run straight to the field because he needed to flee. The boy, confused, asks where he should go. His father then remains silent, telling him to go to Lake Emera. Boris, nervous, questions why he should go there since his nanny had said there was a spirit in that place. His father asks if he really believed in that because of that stupid rumor. No one approached that lake, but that place was safer than any other, mentioning that there would be 3 trees with black trunks near the lake and he should hide in that place because he would fetch him after the fight. The reluctant boy ends up accepting. Then the servant informs the head that it was time, giving an order for the soldiers to advance. Looking back, he asks what Boris was waiting for because he should already be running. Heading towards the lake, Boris thinks his father must be right and it was just a rumor. At the mansion, the battle was already happening. Among it, Vlado was still there, eliminating the enemy soldiers. Looking for where his brother was because he had treated him like a criminal, excluding him from the family. But now he was hiding like a little rat. Then the soldier gives a signal to Vlado saying that his brother was there. Meanwhile, the head's group was completely surrounded. The head, continuing to defeat the soldiers, asks how they dared to invade his territory. Because of that, they would pay with their lives. However, Vlado was already behind him, saying he would see him later. The head, in turn, says it had been an ambush. Vlado mentions that he was no longer the person he used to be, because now he had gotten older, attacking the head of the family again. Tulk, noticing this, tries to help, but Vlado says he would kill him along with the head. However, a flash of light appears in the middle of the battle, leaving everyone disoriented with that fog. Amidst the darkness, someone was making a magic circle. That was Tulk healing the head of the family. Vlado says they were using cowardly tactics, attacking the two, but they end up disappearing, leaving Vlado furious. Meanwhile, the protagonist heads towards Lake Emera, looking for the spot his father had mentioned. Finding the place, Boris thinks his father would fetch him after the war, and the only thing he had to do was wait. Among the bushes, the boy hears a noise, getting scared, questioning what it was, wondering if it was his father or maybe that spirit. Then a black aura appears behind the boy, where tentacles end up grabbing the protagonist. The monster then shows its face, proving that the rumors were not just a lie. Boris thinks his nanny was right, because there really was a monster in that place. Determined, the protagonist thinks he didn't want to die. At the same moment, that monster is sliced. An unknown figure had defeated that creature, who starts approaching the protagonist. That was Yevgen, asking why his brother was in that place, hugging the boy, saying he could have died. Boris, in turn, says that their father had told him to wait there, questioning why his brother was also in that place, mentioning that their father had said he should protect the winter kit. But Yevgen disagreed with their father, saying family was more important than a mere treasure, asking what use a treasure was if they were dead. Treasures could not be protected forever. Standing up, Boris questions how Yevgen knew he was in that place. But the boy just says it was because he was his brother and had to protect him no matter where he was. Then a flash happens, grabbing the protagonist's shoulder. Yevgen asks him to listen carefully, mentioning that their uncle was not the only enemy and the elected head Khan was working with their uncle. He was the one who had imprisoned all the soldiers and mages. That man desired the winter kit, as well as the loyalty and cooperation of the Giant family. For that to happen, their father had to be eliminated. However, their father already knew all that, and that's why he made them both escape as the only hope to continue the family. Soon after, a portal appears with Tulk and their father coming out of it. Questioning what had happened to their father, Tulk warns that he had been poisoned by a very resistant poison, so his magic was useless, asking them to flee first, worried if they were okay. Yevgen mentions that a light had appeared and then disappeared. Tulk in turn becomes apprehensive, assuming that one of Quira's eyes had been activated, a spell that allowed seeing from afar. With that power, the great mage Zhang would be able to find even a needle in a haystack, and since he had seen a light flashing, their location was probably already exposed. Yevgen asks what they should do in that situation. Then Tulk says they should just wish for luck, saying again for them to flee, and if they understood their father's will, they would comprehend that it was just to protect the family and the treasures. Meanwhile, Vlado's soldiers were heading towards the head of the family's location. Vlado, in turn, becomes irritated because they had gone towards Lake Emera, the ancient fear of the Longered people in a forbidden place. A flashback of the past life of the 3 brothers appears as they walked in the fields, the only person they cared about in the Giant house, the only one who saw his older brother and him as equals. On another occasion, Vlado asks how he let Yenny join the family that way. Junker says that he might be from another faction, but that was his decision, and now there was nothing they could do. The only thing they could do was wish her happiness. However, Vlado didn't think that way. Sometime later, the man tells Yenny that her fiancé had gone to Lake Emera. The poor girl is surprised, wondering why. Desperate, she goes to meet her fiancé. Vlado thinks it had been a success, because his subordinate would kidnap her in that place and wouldn't let her go to another family. However, that had been what he had planned, but things did not turn out as he had thought. Some time later, the girl returns to the mansion completely different. She had become a witch because of a spirit. Vlado thinks his plan should have worked and she should not have gone near the lake, saying to his brother that they should call a doctor. But she no longer belonged to this world. Even though he didn't agree with it, he had done something he should never have done. Vlado says he never thought that would happen, because he never thought that Coward would go to Lake Emra. The head, in turn, says that his excuses have no value, and from that day on, he would no longer be part of the Jaimin family, giving the order for everyone to return to their homes. Drawing his sword, he says that insanity due to an evil spirit could only be cured in one way, which was death. Vlado, desperate, begs his brother not to do that. Returning to the present, his group was still heading towards Lake Emra. In the darkness, a group of zombies appears. Desperate, the army starts to flee. While Vlado was defeating the zombies, they kept appearing, mentioning that he could smell that repugnant odor from the lake, and he would be lying if he said he wasn't afraid. Returning to Yevgen, Tulp was telling him to flee with the protagonist. If he understood his father's wishes, he would comprehend that it was just to protect the family. Hearing a noise, the servant says that if they got closer, they would be discovered. However, the boy didn't want to leave and would stay to protect them. Noticing that Vlado was near, he mentions that they could be dead soon. Yevgen says that the family's inheritance should not be protected but used to defend it in such situations. Questioning if his father understood what he was trying to say, looking at the protagonist, he asks if he understood too. But remembering the conversation his father had with his brother, he thinks that he didn't need to live alone in a world without his family. Yevgen in turn says he should think it was glorious for them to die by their own choices. Then Tulk says he would take the lead, and until he died, they shouldn't leave. The boy says that until it was his turn to face him, he wouldn't retreat. Then the protagonist thinks that now he understood why his brother's eyes were blue, and the smile that was incredibly bright. There had always been a strange premonition about that near the lake the four were walking. Junker says they finally made it. Observing the lake, the head remembers his sister. A background voice questions if it was only now that he was looking for her. That was Vlado saying he was doing all that after abandoning her, mentioning that she should be happy to see the brother who had distanced himself. Junker says he would never recognize his sins, and Vlado asks if he came to ask for forgiveness. Then the head goes towards the man saying they were already late for that. Vlado, in turn, accepts the confrontation, saying they would battle until that spirit appeared. Junker says he had given his life and still didn't know his sins. Besides, he used his sharp tongue to turn Yenny into an unjust corpse, similar to the monsters of the lake that writhed. However, Vlado didn't recognize his mistakes, questioning if Junker still blamed him for that. The one who had taken Yenny's life was not him but Junker, saying they would take that battle to the end, where that spirit finally appeared. Meanwhile, Yevgen was protecting his brother from the zombies. The boy starts murmuring, talking nonsense, leaving the protagonist confused. Looking at his brother's hand, he notices it was trembling. Boris thinks his father was really right, remembering his father's words that said the winter kit was only effective if used with another person, mentioning that his brother should survive until the end. Then a flash begins to come out of the sword. Catching Vlado's attention, Yevgen says he was there. Looking around, the protagonist notices everything around was white, questioning what was happening. Beneath the boy, a malevolent aura was lurking, saying that the boy was very beautiful. Then the young man wakes up, noticing he was in a forest and the mountains along with his sword and a horse. Among the hills, Yevgen appears, asking if he had already woken up, suggesting his brother drink some water. Looking at the boy, he asks if Boris was okay and if he had any nightmares. At that moment, the protagonist runs into his brother's arms. With tears on his face, he hugged him with all his strength. Content: his brother also hugs him. The protagonist thinks that it was very strange because before they were at Lake Emra. Besides, his father was fighting Vlado, while his brother was battling those zombies, thinking about what had happened when he was unconscious. Yevgen, in turn, says he needed to fetch more water. So the protagonist asks where they were, responding. His brother says they were in the north of Longard, in a region called Hada Plateau, in the territory of the Gurem family, saying that they had ridden that horse, and then Boris had fallen asleep. But when the boy asks where their father was, Yevgen becomes uneasy, saying he had gone to another place. The situation was unusual, and that's why everyone had split up, asking him not to worry because Tulp would contact them using magic soon. So the protagonist questions what they should do. Yevgen says that meanwhile, they should meet their great aunt. The medical faction she was in didn't have a bad relationship with their father, or they could go in the direction of Elector Karsuya, whom their father served. Boris asks if they couldn't go anywhere, instead of asking for help from strangers, they could simply live a life of commoners. Yevgen didn't know how to live that way because they had always lived with the help of many people. That was a bad year, so the relationship with the nobles wouldn't be good. The boy, in turn, says they could live quietly at least until their father contacted them. At that moment, the protagonist's stomach starts to growl. Yevgen says they should go to a nearby village to eat something. In the village, Yevgen asks the maid for permission to enter. Entering the building, he requests a room. The woman then says it was 10 gold coins. Surprised, the attendant questions how a boy of that age had so much money. Meanwhile, two men were observing the two brothers, asking what people like them were doing there. The attendant asks if they wanted dinner and breakfast, and Yevgen says they just wanted what was available. Then the maid mentions that she thought people of that caliber couldn't eat common foods. In the bar, several people were mocking the two boys, saying they probably didn't know about life. Apologizing for the delay, the other man brings the plate of food. Observing the contents, the protagonist feels disgusted, because that plate had several live larvae. Falling to the floor, Boris becomes desperate because he would have to eat that. The people in the bar start to mock the little boy, asking if he wasn't going to eat, saying that if he didn't know, they should teach him. Then Yevgen takes charge of the situation, asking them to teach him instead of his brother, saying he should eat in front of him. Convinced, that jerk asks if they were hearing that because the rich boy wanted him to take the first bite. Meanwhile, a hand approaches the man's neck. In an instant, Yevgen smashes the man's head on the table, saying that as it was a house specialty, he shouldn't hesitate to eat, inviting the man to sit at the table. Irritated, the man tells him to take his hands off his neck. While Yevgen takes a spoon with the soup, the man asks if the boy would really force him to eat. Boris, observing his brother's actions, is surprised. With a threatening look, Yevgen notices his brother staring at him. Letting go of the man's neck, he says he should be grateful, because he didn't have a strong enough heart to force others. Stating they would eat later, the two withdraw. However, the other people in the bar didn't like their attitudes, questioning where he was going. Quickly, the boy slaps the man, who, fallen to the ground, starts to threaten Yevgen. Reacting to the threat, he thinks about drawing his sword. However, he couldn't do that, and instead of the sword, throws a chair at the man. Then the bar owner tells the men to grab the boy, where a group starts to surround Yevgen, starting to attack together. Meanwhile, he notices two people holding his brother. With a malicious smile, the man says he should have been nice from the beginning, saying that he had caused a mess at a party like that and it seemed he had no manners. Looking at the protagonist, the other man says he should teach him good manners, holding the boy's mouth, apparently trying to force him to eat those larvae. Immobilized, Yevgen asks them to stop, questioning what they were doing with just a child. But the woman says that after his brother, he would be next, questioning if he wanted to eat instead of him. Quickly, the young man accepts to eat his brother's part. The other man says that if he wanted to, then there was no choice, asking him to take a bite, and if he refused, he would give everything to his brother. Opening his mouth, Yevgen eats those larvae. With a threatening look, the young man watches the man, who becomes scared by that determination. Then he swallows those larvae, saying that his name was Yevgen Jaimin, eldest son of Junkard Jaimin, the Lord of Longard, challenging that man to a duel. The people around are surprised that he was the son of the Lord of Longard. Outside the tavern, the boy asks the man to reveal his identity, because at that moment he would kill him. But first, he would give him a chance to redeem himself. During the duel, he should admit his defeat by lying face down on the ground, and he swore he would make him consume every drop of that soup. Observing his brother, the protagonist thinks that although he had seen him wield a sword before, he had never seen him in a duel, mentioning that he seemed like a completely different person. The other guy, in turn, gets nervous, wondering if he wouldn't kill him. Looking at Yevgen's sword, the people around question what sword that was. Then the other man says he had seen a sword like that before. Somewhere in the world there is a winter sword, asking if that was really possible because that boy had it. The man thinks that if those rumors were true, it would be too risky to fight face to face. Now that he was in that situation, he should strike first, rushing towards Yevgen. Quickly, the boy defends the attack. The man wonders why he was so strong. With a penetrating look, Yevgen observed him, delivering an attack on the man's sword, which ends up breaking his sword. The people around are surprised by the boy's skill, questioning how he had done that. The other guy on the ground, completely defeated, says that it was impossible. Meanwhile, Yevgen was already above him, about to deliver another attack. Kneeling, the man begs not to be killed. Yevgen asks if he was accepting his defeat. Quickly, the man affirms he was doing that. Sometime later, that man inside the tavern was about to eat that soup. Taking the spoon, the man opens his mouth, eating those larvae. After the man had eaten everything, Yevgen calls the protagonist to leave. Later in their quarters, Boris asks if he was worried about something, saying he was happy he was okay because he had won. But at that time, he was completely different. However, he knew he had no choice, and if their father were there, he would surely praise him. Yevgen says he did the right thing and no one knew him better than he did. And he had realized that their father was right, because he shouldn't let his heart soften with empathy. If he could take care of Boris forever, he would surely ensure he had a kind heart, but he couldn't stay by his side forever. Because he had his own path to follow. To find his way, he must become stronger, and he must close himself off so others wouldn't know what he had inside. So he should understand that quickly, because the world wouldn't let him be weak. The protagonist asks if he had decided to return to the clan, thinking that he had said that out of fear he would become weak, because now they were alone. Yevgen suggests they go to sleep, asking him not to take off the armor because he didn't know who might enter at night, saying he would stand guard so he could sleep first, mentioning he would wake him at midnight. Sometime later, Boris wakes up, noticing his brother sitting by the bed, asking if it wasn't already midnight. Looking closer, he sees tears falling from his brother's face, wondering if he was dreaming because it was the first time he had seen him cry, and if he should console him, but he didn't have the capacity for that, returning to sleep on the bed. By day, the protagonist was riding a horse next to his brother. Remembering the previous night, Boris thinks he had never seen that side of his brother and wonders if he should say something. Asking what the name of that flower was, remembering that in the past he told stories about flowers, questioning if Yevgen had forgotten that at sunset. His brother says he couldn't see the city, and it seemed they would have to camp at night. Later, the two are resting by a campfire. With a cold look, Yevgen stands up, asking his brother to grab his sword, saying that he had followed them there but still chose to be a coward. From the bushes, an unknown figure appears. A man with an axe in his hand appears with several soldiers by his side. Yevgen mentions that he had many subordinates to protect him, noticing that the guy he had forced to eat the soup was also there. However, the other man says they weren't there to help that man, but to obtain that sword. Yevgen thinks that was expected since when he had the chance he didn't finish that man, assuming it must have been a mistake to reveal his name. Then the other man asks what they were waiting for, giving the order to attack them, charging at the two brothers. Quickly, Yevgen defends the attacks, saying that it was a sword they would never have, observing his skills. The other man says he wasn't bad at all, asking if the boy could withstand his attack. Coldly, Yevgen seems to await the attack. However, he loses concentration as a chain is wrapped around his sword. Another man appears, saying that he was good for a child, but it was all over now, and he wouldn't be able to use any of his strength in that situation. Then Yevgen uses his sword's ability, freezing those chains which end up breaking. The other man says it was an honor to witness something that was once only rumors. The legendary power that froze anything was real, mentioning that looking at that sword made his mouth water, thinking about what would happen if he did something to his brother. Yevgen supposes that all his movements were exposed and it wouldn't be difficult to defeat them, but he couldn't abandon his brother. Boris, in turn, says that 12 years was not a short time. The people around mock the boy, asking what he was saying. The protagonist says it meant he knew when he needed to die, and that wasn't the time. Irritated, the man says they would see if that was true, rushing towards the poor boy. However, he doesn't hesitate for a moment. Desperate, Yevgen asks him to stop. The other man tells the boy to feel his arrogance, but at that moment, an arrow hits the man's neck, falling dead to the ground. Everyone around is surprised, asking what had happened. Questioning where that arrow had come from quickly, Yevgen embraces the protagonist, protecting him from the arrows. Confused, the boy also didn't know where those arrows were coming from. In the background, an unknown figure says he had fought very well. Then a group of hooded figures appears, showing part of his face. The man says they were their saviors, and if they couldn't thank him a little. Suspecting that group, the boy thanks them, saying he wouldn't give anything in return. The other man, in turn, asks if he had something to offer them. Noticing that all those people from before had been killed by that group, Yevgen thinks they were very skilled, questioning if they were allies or enemies. The other man says they seemed to be children of a rich man and if their father had something to offer, saying they would be satisfied just with that bonfire. Then Yevgen, thanking them, mentions they seem skilled. Revealing their identities, the man in the yellow hood says his name was Kami, and the other was Jokum. The one with the mustache was called Joel, and people called him Screw. The other girl says her name was Goto, and people called her Janny. Noticing that the two brothers still didn't trust them, the man says they could lead the bonfire if they wanted. But the two didn't want that, saying they could rest. Around the bonfire, the two brothers rested with that group. The other woman hands a gurney to the protagonist, asking if he wouldn't eat immediately, saying it wasn't poisoned. Looking at the two, the girl asks if he was his brother because he was too young to be wandering around those deserted lands. As you can see, they accepted work for money and sometimes went to places offering work for enough money, asking if he had heard of the immortal land. Canopoli long ago was a magical kingdom so prosperous that the city was wrapped in gold. But now they had nothing because of the war, and now it was a land full of vengeful spirits and death. The mortal land is a place where people enter alive and return dead. Observing the boy, she asks if that story had surprised him and he should be imagining horrible things judging by his expression. Yevgen says it was practically impossible for her to have returned alive from that place because that place could not be entered and exited easily. It was no wonder that was the name. The other man asks him to look at that arrow in his hand. The tip of it had something, telling him to be careful not to touch it because it was a deadly poison capable of killing even ghosts. Then the woman asks him to stop with that because it wasn't as if they were in Ganapoli, because they just walked through the place, bringing things that the ghosts use. Asking the two if they wanted something as a gift. Shoving a golden ring, she hands it to the protagonist. Looking at that ring, Boris notices some images on it, where several people were dancing, mentioning that it was very bright, and he had never seen a city of gold, but it seemed to be in front of him. The dust of the sand that shines under the sun, the giant golden pillars along with the roof of the place. All of that was incredible. Sometime later, the protagonist was apparently inside a hotel. The owner of that place welcomes them. In that place, the people from before were also with the two brothers. Then the man says she seemed tired and the girl replies that she had some problems earlier, Handing a key to Yevgen, she says they must be tired and should rest a bit. Accepting the offer, Yevgen thanks her. Going up the stairs, the man bids them good night. Sleepy, the protagonist mentions that it had been a very tiring day. Affirming, Yevgen says they could rest a bit today, since now there shouldn't be anyone following them. A flashback of Boris's life appears with someone calling him. That was Vlado standing in front of him, but Boris didn't know who he was, responding that he was his uncle. He asks if the protagonist was playing alone, questioning what that toy was and if he wanted to show him something really fun. Picking up the boy, he lifts him. Vlado says he would never forget that, wondering what would happen when that person knew about it. While still holding the boy in his arms, Vlado heads towards a well. About to place the boy inside, he begs his uncle to stop with a frightening look. His uncle seemed to have no remorse. Then Boris wakes up tied up. In the background, his brother was also tied up, saying he had finally woken up. Boris, in turn, asks where they were, then Yevgen says they should escape quickly because the sword had disappeared. Confused, the protagonist asks who could have done that. However, his brother starts to laugh hysterically, saying that Boris was still a child who didn't know the world, that he hoped he wouldn't be like him at his age, affirming that the protagonist should have been taught by their father instead of him. But from now on, it was time to repay what they had received. In the reception area of that place, Yevgen throws the man to the ground, saying he had no time to waste, and he would ask only once, questioning who had tied them up. The man says he didn't want to get involved in that, and they hadn't said Yevgen could fight, and at least those sponsorships weren't on him. Confused, Yevgen asks what he had said before, saying that it was indeed Janika's name. That gang had sold him to Lacortable. Those people bought people and used them as mercenaries until they got their money, mentioning they would come to pick him up soon. Yevgen, in turn, asks where that gang was. Then the man informs they were at Helmer's tavern and would leave again that night because that was the time they usually move. With a threatening look, Yevgen calls his brother, saying he was in a hurry. Sometime later, the boy asks the protagonist to stay at a distance and watch everything. Yevgen thinks he should make sure to punish those who deceived him, and his brother needed to see all that, mentioning he wanted him to be a kind person, but didn't have time for that. Soon after, Yevgen enters the tavern. The people around were discussing a noble family that had been completely destroyed. Observing two people, he realizes they were those men from before. Questioning where the others were entering the bar, the boy grabs a plate. Meanwhile, he hides his sword. Approaching the man, Yevgen asks if he had called him, but the man didn't know what he was talking about. Yevgen, in turn, says that a lady was outside asking about him. Looking up, the man says that was very strange. When he was about to finish the sentence, he notices the face of the person in front of him. Suddenly, the two become desperate. Then Yevgen hits that plate on the man's face, quickly draws his sword, piercing his hand. Nervous, the other man asks who he was. Then the boy says he was there to find his sword. However, the man wasn't in the mood for conversation, attacking Yevgen, who easily dodges. Attacking the man, he defends his strike, saying it wasn't his business. Immobilizing the man, Yevgen says he was just a shameless thief, asking him to tell where the sword was before cutting his wrist. Also wanting to know where Janika was. Responding, the man says they were going to sell his sword for money. Starting to leave, the man says Janika, along with the black gloves, would come after his head. Pointing the sword at the other man, he says he already knew that would happen and shouldn't have fallen for that dirty scheme. Then he says Janika would negotiate the sword, but that was just to show it off. She probably planned to keep it for herself. The main weapon of Romovac is a crossbow, so he must insist on selling the sword and dividing the money. If he went to the north entrance of the village around midnight, he would see a group of mercenaries, and if they saw him there, they would be eager to hand him over to the mercenaries, mentioning that he should remember Janika was a dangerous woman, but Yevgen would definitely regret in the tree was her. Soon after, the commander calls her, saying they were finished there. Looking back, Janaka and her gang never asked why they were running away, supposing they had ulterior motives from the start. Their knights had been killed and their money stolen, but at least his brother was safe, and they had recovered their sword. In his thoughts, someone strangled the protagonist, questioning if they were being pursued again, asking for his brother's help. However, the one choking him was himself. Waking up, Boris thinks it had all been a dream. Looking to the side, he sees his brother resting, wondering why he was lying on the floor that way. But he leaves him alone because he must be tired, wrapped up while sleeping next to him. At that moment, Yevgen wakes up, restless. The next day, Yevgen, along with his brother, appears in a shop to sell some things. Showing an object, he asks how much it could be worth. The man mentions that it wasn't bad and was well preserved. However, it was very old, offering the boy 300 coins. Yevgen says that value was too low. The man, irritated, asks if he thought that object was new, and if he wanted to get a higher value, the only choice was stealing. But maybe an old lady could use it, although it was out of fashion. Then Yevgen accepts that value. Sometime later, the boy buys various foods for his brother to eat, mentioning that all that seemed very good. The protagonist wonders how he could eat that, thinking that his brother never sold anything for less than 3,000, and that meal was paid for by their mother's memory, affirming he was okay with just dry bread and water, wondering how long he would treat him that way. Calling his brother, Boris asks when their father would find them. The boy replies that it would take a little more time, and he was sure he was trying to heal his wounds, so they should eat that food and make sure they stayed healthy. Thus, they would be ready to see their father when they could. Then the protagonist says he was right, but observing his brother, he notices he got a sad look. Sometime later, while sleeping, that dream continues to repeat, wondering why it was happening again. However, when he wakes up, he notices his own brother was actually doing that. At that moment, Yevgen pulls the boy, throwing him against the wall. Observing the sword, Yevgen thinks about grabbing it. Then the protagonist hugs his brother, questioning if he would really kill him, asking what he was doing and if something was wrong with him, asking him to wake up, but that was also a dream. Yevgen, beside him, asks if he had a nightmare. Looking at his brother, Boris remembers that image from his dream, becoming desperate about it. Then he starts to feel a pain in his back. Quickly, his brother gets up, asking if something was wrong with him. Remembering his dream again, the boy is reluctant to say anything, mentioning he had fallen while sleeping. Yevgen in turn says that usually happens and he must be very tired, and since they rested well that day, they would leave again. Sometime later, the two brothers were walking in a forest. The protagonist thinks it wasn't a dream nor an illusion, but he didn't believe his brother was in his right mind when he tried to kill him. His hands were warm and moist when he strangled him, and it was as if he had a fever. Moreover, it seemed he didn't remember everything he had done before, questioning what he was hiding. Then the boy asks if his brother is okay. Saying yes, he begins to distance himself a bit from Boris. The boy thinks that he really wasn't okay, and they were continuously on the move without asking for help, wondering if they were really going to their aunt's estate, questioning his brother if their father would come to get them, asking him to be honest and tell what happened. But his brother asks him to wait just a little longer. Boris thinks there was something strange, recalling the giant monster that had invaded the mansion, and the other that had attacked him at the lake, wondering why his memories were so vague, and why he had really gone to Lake Emra. Then Yevgen says that their father was not coming back. Some time ago, he went to a place from where he couldn't return, mentioning that he was with Butler and Tulk, so he didn't need them, asking his brother to pay attention. At that moment, a terrifying creature appears behind the protagonist. With a penetrating look, it observes him. About to attack the boy, his brother appears in front of him, asking him to run. Soon after, blood begins to gush. Recalling his nana's words, he mentions that it was the spirit. It didn't seem dead or alive, but its eyes were like balls of fire just looking at the world. The spirit had hit Yevgen with its enormous wing. Wondering what had happened to himself after that, the boy had run like a coward without looking back even for a second, while his brother, the protagonist of that attack. In the present, the two brothers were resting by a campfire. Yevgen, in turn, asks him to go somewhere else when he wakes up the next day, mentioning that he couldn't stay with him and didn't have much time, leaving the protagonist completely shaken by his words. However, the boy didn't want to be separated from his brother, saying he would stay by his side until the end, but if he stayed with him, Yevgen might end up killing him. The spirit of Lake Emra was the one who had killed Aunt Yenny. Yevgen remembered his aunt as someone who was a good and kind person, but when she came back from the lake, that personality no longer existed. Her voice was like the scream of a monster, a madness that could only be released with the option of death. That was the brief future that awaited him. Then Yevgen asks Boris to try to hold the sword and swing it. However, it was still too heavy for him. Yevgen says it would be great if his brother were a little older, and if he could at least live long enough to accompany him. That way he could survive on his own. However, he couldn't grow up immediately. While his remaining time was passing quickly, soon he could end up harming him. The protagonist, surprised by his words, thinks it seemed like he was about to leave him, pleading in his thoughts for his brother not to go away, saying he didn't care if he killed him, affirming that he couldn't survive alone, and that there were countless people coming after them who could be much stronger than the ones before. so he wanted to stay by his side. Then Yevgen slaps his brother, asking if he had forgotten what he had said before, telling him never to say he would die again after he left. He should become strong. Hugging the boy, Yevgen says that no one else would protect him, so he couldn't rest in any shadow, and he should never trust anyone or let his guard down around people. The whole process would be difficult, but it would be worth doing all that as long as he was alive. Countless possibilities could happen. Handing the sword to Boris, the boy says that was all he wanted to say, and if he went crazy again, he allowed Boris to kill him. Yevgen is thinking that his memory was starting to fragment, and he wonders what he would do if he didn't know who he was. The young man begins to imagine the possibility of going mad and thrashing like a monster, just like his aunt Janine. Or even because of what was happening, he might have hurt his brother Boris. Yevgen explains what was happening to him and comments that when he thought it was morning, he realized it was already afternoon. As he lit the campfire for his camp, the night sky had already risen without him even noticing. Looking at the moon with a vacant expression, the only thing Yevgen can say is that he was becoming something he didn't recognize. The young man tells himself that he was very afraid, as what he feared most was hurting and seeing his brother's lifeless body when he opened his eyes. While after that event, the sun begins to rise. Boris, who had gone out for a moment to gather some branches, returns to the camp and sees his brother lying near a tree, almost asleep. The boy questions Yevgen why he doesn't sleep a little, as it had been 3 days since the young man had been awake. Still with that same vacant expression, the older brother cannot believe it had been 3 days since he was awake. Our protagonist, seeing that nothing would help, just puts the sticks on the ground. Soon after, his brother approaches and states that he should keep the snow armor as he no longer needed it. Boris promptly refuses, retorting that it belonged to Yevgen. However, the young man informs him that armor would be of no use to a dead man. As he takes the armor in his hands, our protagonist remains still, not knowing what to say. His brother, sensing that he was in his last moments, asks if the boy could promise never to seek revenge. He explains that for a long period, countless nobles of Travaches tore themselves apart in wars of political factions, and if only one side had chosen to forget that resentment or chosen to forgive the other side first, that tragedy would not have happened. Yevgen adds that through the dispute between his father and uncle, everything happened, and for that reason he prayed every day that Boris would never get involved in those family quarrels. The older brother comments that the boy will grow up and continue to experience and see new things. And when that happens, he wanted Boris to forget what had happened until that day and forgive his uncle. After that conversation between the two, night finally falls. While Boris was taking a nap, Yevgen still continues trying to stay awake. The young man, who was almost dozing off, wakes up and thinks to himself that he couldn't sleep. Yevgen continues trying to fight off sleep until, at one moment, he imagines himself in a field of flowers where his father and sister were calling him. Boris, seeing his brother lying down, goes to him, closing his eyes and asking the young man to sleep and rest peacefully. The blonde, even after that, wakes up and sees Boris returning to lie down and sleep. He keeps his eyes open, lying on that comfortable grass. Suddenly, he sees something amazing. Looking up at the sky, several shooting stars begin to fall. Yevgen stands up, simply enchanted by the scene. The boy makes a decision and states in his mind that he now knows what he can do for his brother. We see a letter written by Yevgen saying to Boris that after a long, stressful day, it was time to rest, and the shooting stars had left a trail behind. The letter also said that Boris should not worry and sleep well, because his brother would protect him, and no one would wake him. Boris, on the morning of that day, looking to his side, saw a hole and immediately realized what was happening. The letter continues, and Yevgen states that when Boris feels afraid of the dark, he should not worry, because tomorrow will soon arrive, and he should forget the difficult world outside. The young man also asks his younger brother to have a good dream, as he always gives him a goodnight kiss. Then finally, our protagonist reaches the bottom of that hole and sees his brother already lifeless. The letter ends with Yevgen saying that he will always be by his younger brother's side, and he should remember that if he has a good dream, the night will pass in an instant. We go back a little before Yevgen committed that act, and we see the young man kneeling after digging the hole and looking at the sky. After digging all that with his bare hands, the young man remains kneeling for a while, just watching that beautiful scene before his eyes. He finally thinks a little more about what he was going to do and makes his decision. The young man looks back and upon seeing Boris sleeping, observes the boy for a moment. Yevgen's poor brother remains in a deep sleep, not even imagining that something tragic would happen that night. Before leaving, our protagonist's older brother makes sure to add more wood to the fire to keep him warm. And finally, he covers Boris' body with a blanket to ensure the boy stays well. Boris notices this but soon goes back to sleep, and Yevgen walks toward the hole. We see that in the middle of the excavation, the ice sword was embedded. The young man stands still in front of it, just staring at his cruel fate. Then he accepts everything, and shortly after, with a smile, he throws himself, knowing it was the best thing for his family. With that event, the birds fly, and we finally return to the moment when Boris was facing that scene. The boy notices that beside his brother, the sword was in a different position. With an expression full of despair, the poor boy falls to his knees devastated. He realizes that Yevgen probably dug that hole with his bare hands and after throwing himself onto the sword, used all of his remaining strength to pull it out of his body. In tears, our protagonist wonders why his brother didn't even let him do something to stop it. Our protagonist takes off his icy armor and puts it on his brother's lifeless body, while stating that Yevgen couldn't even live his own life. Shortly after, also with his bare hands, he begins to bury his brother's body, who still had a peaceful look on his face. After that, the young man throws some grass on top and asks his brother to sleep well. Jaemin, knowing he had to do something about it, picks up the Inverness sword and starts walking aimlessly. In a city, we see a blonde noblewoman yelling at her maid, questioning if she was really going to keep wearing those clothes. With that, the maid tries to explain that they were in the countryside, and that the clothes the noblewoman usually wore were custom-made. The blonde woman is not satisfied with that response, as anyone could wear those clothes, and she wonders how she could wear such servant attire. The maid goes out into the city in search of a tailor to make clothes for her mistress. Sad, the girl thinks that it wasn't her fault that the luggage fell from the carriage into a puddle of mud, but still, she was suffering for it. The girl also thinks that they weren't in an Almorad, but in Travach's, and wonders where they could possibly find a dress. After some time walking around the city, the girl comments that no matter where she looks, she couldn't see a tailor shop, and maybe she should visit his seamstress. Boris arrives in the city, and some people begin gossiping about him, wondering why the boy had such a stoic expression and was carrying a sword. These people even envy the Invernate, which was sheathed by Boris's side, as it was very bright. The blonde noblewoman's maid, seeing this, remarks that the boy seemed to be her age and couldn't believe he was walking around carrying that sword. In her head, she says that poor boy seemed really tired and wonders where he was going. She then realizes that the young man was stopping in front of an establishment. Upon closer inspection, the maid notices that it seemed like a disguised tavern, so she tries to warn our protagonist. The girl goes up to Boris and tells him he shouldn't go into that place recklessly, as the boy had no idea what could happen inside and it was very dangerous. Still, with a devastated expression, the only thing Jaemin responds is that he was fine and continues on his way. Seeing this, the maid wonders to herself why the boy's expression was so heavy. As he enters the tavern, she comments that it seemed like he had a layer of darkness over his face. Inside, Boris approaches the attendant, excuses himself, and the young woman promptly welcomes him. The boy, skipping all formalities, simply states that he would like a room. The attendant asks if he was alone, and the boy quickly responds that he was. Then she chooses a common room and tells Boris the price. She explains how our protagonist should get to the room and mentions that his bed was a bit small, but it wouldn't be a problem, as the young man was still a child. Boris doesn't seem to complain and just asks for one more thing. He wonders if there was a place willing to hide a child like him for work. The young man comments that he didn't need money, just food and a roof over his head. In the last flashback of Yevgen, we see him before committing that act beside his brother, asking the boy to live, endure, and survive that cold winter. After our protagonist says that the attendant thinks that, although he seemed to be living on his own, it still looked like he had a good life. The waitress responds that she couldn't offer many things to the boy, but she thinks the mercenary is their meat and Iran boy. Suddenly, a person named Punin raises his hand and calls Tonya to bring another beer over. The girl agrees and asks for just a second. Then she informs Boris that the man's name is Punin, and he was the blacksmith of that town. Tonya also adds that Punin often says he needs an assistant, so the young man should talk to him. Before leaving, Tonya asks for our protagonist's name and introduces herself. Even hesitant, as he doesn't trust anyone, the boy introduces himself back. After talking with the blacksmith for a while, the man comments that Boris seems so thin and weak and questions if he was capable of surviving a blacksmith's work. Our protagonist replies that honestly, he wasn't sure what needed to be done, but he had determination. Punin is happy that, at least, the boy wasn't a liar. He also says he imagines that Boris wasn't born in a peasant's home, so he asks which family he came from if there had been any recent conflict. In his head, the blacksmith thinks that he sold some weapons to a few noble families recently. The man tells himself that conflicts often happen between noble families, and the reason is usually when one wants to kill the other to gain their possessions. So if Boris experienced one of those conflicts, he could understand why he had that expression. Seeing that Boris didn't want to talk, Punin promptly understands. However, he still comments that it wasn't important. Then the blacksmith asks Boris to come to the forge tomorrow morning, as he'll give the boy some work, and if he finds it too much, he can leave. Tony arrives saying it was nice that they had already settled things and asks Boris to thank the man. But the boy remains silent and only nods his head. Later, the young woman serves a plate of food for the boy and tells him that it was the special soup they serve at the inn. Tanya asks the poor boy to eat it before it gets cold. Boris still remains silent, and the young woman says he needs to change the habit of not saying thank you when he feels grateful. Hearing this, as he grabs his utensils, the boy, though embarrassed, thanks her for the food. Tanya just says goodbye and shortly after asks the boy to rest as she leaves. Lying next to his sword after the meal, our protagonist seems a bit reflective about something. He thinks that even though the blacksmith makes farming tools or weapons, the work will definitely be tiring, but he wasn't really worried about that. The real problem was whether he could trust those people. Boris comments to himself that even the people he considered close betrayed him when they faced a crisis, and even the people who saved him before approaching him stole his sword and sold it to some mercenaries. That's why the boy wonders if those people could be planning something similar. So still with that thought, Boris says that the friendlier someone is, the more rotten the betrayal could be. That's why it was better for him to check if the forge really existed and if the blacksmith was a trustworthy person. As he leaves the tavern, someone was speeding by on a horse. So idiot nobles almost run people over in the street, shouting at them to get out of the way immediately. The young man, upon seeing Boris in his path, asks if the boy was crazy, but the child seemed to be lost in thought. With extreme arrogance, the wealthy youth doesn't seem to try to slow down to prevent the accident and continues straight, stating that Boris should get out of the way. Boris, unfortunately, doesn't react quickly enough and is hit by the horse's hoof, which gets startled. Our protagonist is thrown to the ground, injured. The jerk asks why the boy did that and if he wanted to die. He states that if Boris stayed in their way, he'd better get on his knees and beg for forgiveness. All the nobles gather to mock Boris, and the other people present apparently back away, fearing what might happen next. Boris apologizes for getting in the way of those people, but states that they were wrong for riding so fast in a place full of people. The leader of the jerks dismounts and another rich boy follows him, commenting that the peasant needed to learn a lesson to know his place. The blonde then pulls out a whip and says that's exactly what he was thinking of doing. He begins whipping Boris repeatedly, who merely curls up, protecting his sword. After beating the boy, the jerk asks if he finally understood how life works. Curled up, Boris thinks that if he were big enough to draw that sword, he could defend himself, and if his brother Yevgen were there, he could save him. However, he sharpens his gaze and notes that those thoughts are useless. The young man begins to stand, and upon seeing this, the nobles are impressed. Jaimin tells himself that he must stand on his own because he is alone in this world. Our protagonist also remembers that his brother sacrificed himself so he could live, and therefore he wouldn't die at the hands of people like them. Elsewhere, we see the same noble girl from before questioning her maid if she really hadn't found the dress. Furious, the blonde shouts that it was ridiculous and made no sense because there's no city without a tailor, and she wonders what the nobles there wear. The Princess of Belnor continues irritated, and her maid tries to apologize as despite searching the entire city, she couldn't find a place that sold dresses. The maid also thinks that she hadn't seen any tailor shops around, and all she saw was a boy who probably had some social problems. Suddenly, the girl's father calls her Rose and asks if he can come in. The girl, extremely excited, immediately agrees. Soon after, Count Ganneman appears, showing the dress and saying he'd brought it for his daughter. Upon receiving the dress, the young woman is completely enchanted and declares that her father is the best person in the world. He then asks her to get dressed quickly, as they will go for a walk through the city that night. The man also mentions that learning and observing the traditions of other countries is a good way to help her grow, and Rose promptly agrees. Later, we see the Count galloping with his horse and some attendants around him. Rose, confused, asks her father where he got that dress, as Kamiya couldn't even find a store. The Count explains that he bought it from someone who makes custom orders, and his daughter asks if the noble women of that country don't wear dresses. Ganneman explains that there are no nobles in Travanches. He seems interested in something and asks his servant to take care of his daughter, then immediately rides off with his horse along with his attendants. Upon seeing a scene, the Count becomes irritated and orders some people to stop immediately. We then see that those people are the rich jerks from the previous chapter, who were beating our protagonist. The young man, completely injured, is hugging his sword, unable to defend himself. Some peasants think that finally someone capable of stopping those people had arrived. The waitress from the tavern and the blacksmith also arrived at the scene. Confused by the situation, the Count then asks the delinquents what all the commotion was about. Immediately, they become irritated and start arguing with the noble, calling him a foreigner. Injured and completely debilitated, our protagonist watches the scene, and Ganneman orders all those jerks to leave. They promptly refuse and even threaten the nobleman, who draws his sword and states that they had brought this upon themselves. One of the rich boys, sitting on a horse, asks if he wasn't too old to be playing the hero. The jerk quickly charges at his opponent, who simply stares at him. Ganneman swiftly defends himself with his sword, striking his opponent's weapon and causing the boy to lose his balance. With the force of his attack, the Count even manages to hurl the noble's sword far away. The boy's sword flies off, landing embedded in the ground, and the nobleman points his blade at the jerk, asking if he still wanted to continue. The young man, with literally a sword at his throat, realizes he's in deep trouble. Desperate, he orders all his friends to start running and calls the Count a wretched beggar. One of the Count's attendants picks up Boris, who is on the ground, and places him on his horse, while the Count asks if someone could find a doctor. The waitress from the tavern, who had helped our protagonist earlier, quickly approaches the Count and says there's a pharmacist 3 houses away. Rose was extremely worried, calling out for her father. The man takes his daughter back into his arms and mentions that he made her worry, but everything was fine now, and no one else he saw would suffer the injustices of a noble. He also tells his daughter that she should keep that in mind and do the same. However, while looking at Boris, who was completely injured, the girl can only think that she didn't like dirty people. The next morning, our protagonist begins to wake up in a comfortable bed. The young man, confused, wonders where he was and asks if those flowers on the wallpaper were from his mother's room. Jaemin looks to the side and quickly gets up, startled, realizing his sword wasn't there. A woman was beside our protagonist and informs him that his sword was under his bed. Confused, the young man asks where he was, and while wiping his face, the woman explains that she needed him to stay still because she was going to check his injuries. The woman also asks where Boris's home was, and the boy promptly responds that he didn't have one. So she asks if he was a traveler, as he didn't seem like one. The former noble explains that even if he had a home, he couldn't return to it, and that's no different from not having one. The maid sighs and asks if he was a little boy with some kind of tragic past, since those are usually the stories of children who leave home. She also comments that the count saved him because he was kind, but the boy shouldn't bother the man and should return home. Boris becomes extremely confused, and the servant informs him that it was Count Belnor of Animard who saved Jaemin. Camille arrives at the scene carrying some clothes and asks if the little boy had woken up. The woman approaches Boris and examines him for some reason. Then she says that the boy was mistreated for staying at that type of inn, and that's why Boris should consider himself truly grateful that Ganymede had passed by. Immediately after, Camille also hands a set of clothes to our protagonist and asks if he could move. Then she states that the Count wanted Boris at dinner, so after getting ready, the boy heads to the table. Ganymede welcomes Boris and says he's happy to see him up and about. Seeing this, our protagonist can only think that the person in front of him is Count Belnor, the one who saved him. We see that on the table, there's a huge feast with various dishes. One of the butlers arrives with even more plates of food for the family. While serving himself, the Count tells our protagonist that once Boris tries the food, he'll understand the true taste of Belcruz. Rose gets excited and begins explaining that these are truffle omelets, made from truffles that grow in their territory, and they are quite famous. The Count agrees and comments that the boy must be starving, so he should eat as soon as possible. As he picks up his utensils, Boris thinks it's been a long time since he's had such a complete meal. He cuts the omelet and then takes a bite. The young man loves the food, and the Count responds that he's glad Boris enjoyed it. Immediately after, he asks to introduce himself formally and explains that he is Count Belnor of Belcruz, Ganymede, and this is his heir and only daughter, Roseness of Belnor. In the midst of his thoughts, our protagonist says that now that the Count has formally introduced himself, he will also need to introduce himself. The young man introduces himself as Boris Jaemin, thinking that since Belnor isn't from his country, the Count probably wouldn't know about his family. However, unexpectedly, upon hearing this, the Count seems to understand something. He asks if Boris was from the Longgard family, and the boy is shocked to hear that. The Count continues his explanation and says that he's heard that it's a famous family of sword-fighting warriors, and he asks if Boris's family had faced some kind of problem. Our protagonist responds that his father had passed away and his uncle was now leading the family. Upon hearing this, the Count assumes that Boris's uncle's political views differ from his father's, and he asks where the boy planned to go, as he doubted Boris would return. The young man only responds that he didn't have any destination in mind, unfortunately. He only confirms that a certain blacksmith intends to hire him, so he was thinking of going with him, and the Count asks if he was really interested in that type of work. Boris replies that he wasn't sure and would have to work hard to start liking that kind of job. Belnor proposes an offer and asks Boris what he thinks about going to a Namarad with them. Jaemin feels a bit hesitant about the sudden offer and stays silent for a moment. Rose doesn't seem to like the idea and questions if her father really wanted to bring that boy to their home, but the man replies that it was Boris's decision to make. He was merely offering a suggestion. Boris, confused, asks why he received such an offer, and the Count responds that he would tell the reason, but he recommended that Boris shouldn't listen. However, the boy insists, stating that if there was a reason behind the suggestion, he would like to hear the details. The Count agrees and then explains that he intended to make good use of the boy. Upon hearing this, Boris silently thinks to himself that there had to be a reason behind why this man was being so friendly. Ganymede tells our protagonist that he already has everything a man could want. He has an adorable daughter, so if he doesn't need another child, but against his will, he needs a child Boris's age. Because some time ago, before Rose was born, he made a bet with a certain friend. The bet was that when they had children and they turned 10 years old, their children would duel each other with swords, and the loser would grant the winner one wish. As time passed and Rose was born, Ganymede forgot about the bet. But last year, out of nowhere, he heard news about this friend, whom he hadn't seen in a long time, and learned that he had 2 sons, though unfortunately, the older one was an idiot. This friend, after finding out that Count Ganymede had a daughter, put his younger son through intense training with an expert swordsmanship instructor. So if this friend wins, he could request Rose's hand in marriage to his older son. Rose immediately drops her drink, exclaiming that it was ridiculous. The girl asks her father if he's serious, as she has no intention of marrying an idiot. Ganymede asks his daughter to calm down and swears on his honor that he won't let that happen. Our protagonist, confused, points out that since he isn't the Viscount's son, he has no right to fight in this duel and asks what his role would be. The man then explains that he would simply say he adopted Boris and raised him in a separate region, bringing him back now for the duel. Thus, Boris would be treated as the Count's son. He also says that if Boris wins, he will receive an unparalleled reward, and even if he doesn't, he won't be punished. He'll just be asked to leave the territory. Still confused, the boy asks why he was chosen when there were many other people in the village. Jaemin also says that he was just a random person the Count helped by coincidence, and beyond that, the man didn't know anything about him. The Count replies that while he could find dozens of ordinary boys, it wouldn't be easy to find one who has received some form of education. The man also informs him that once they arrive in Anamurad, Boris will have to act immediately as if he were the Count's adopted son, with honor and etiquette. Moreover, Jaemin's family was one of the most famous sword-fighting families, and Boris undoubtedly had that natural talent within him. That's why the Count asks what Boris thought of the proposal and if he would join them. The boy ponders deeply, realizing that his life had no other real options. Our protagonist tells himself that if he goes with the blacksmith, he'll be able to live a peaceful and quiet life, and it wouldn't be bad to live while hiding his identity. Compared to that, Anamurad is a far-off land, and if he goes there, he'll face new challenges and obstacles. But by doing so, he'll be able to leave Travaches, which has been his main goal. After all, it was this land that killed his father and brother, and he lost so much simply because he was born there. After accepting the offer, as he prepares to leave, the boy begins to think that he truly wants to leave, because this country is tainted with blood. Before boarding the carriage to start a new life, Boris looks back, remembering his brother asking him to survive, and thus he makes his decision. During the journey, we see several carriages traveling down a dirt road. Inside one of them is our protagonist, along with Camilla and Rose. The blonde girl looks at Boris, thinking that the boy doesn't talk much, and that it's incredibly boring. Rose then asks Camilla which one of them was older, and the maid responds that she wasn't sure. Rose tells Boris that she knows he is 12 years old because he had mentioned it before, and she is also 12, so she wants to know who is younger between them. She's trying to start a conversation, thinking that through this interaction they might be able to talk a bit before they get home. However, cutting the conversation short, the only thing Boris replies is that he doesn't care. The boy says she could be older sister if she wanted, and the girl gets extremely irritated. She tells him to wait and asks when his birthday is, since hers is on April 8th. He replies that his birthday is on June 12th. Hearing this, the only thing Rose says is that he's boring. Boris, to put an end to the conversation, declares that he will be her older brother, but Rose is quite confused, thinking that's not how she wanted things to go. During the trip, a small argument starts between the two, and the bickering continues for a few hours. A bit farther away, already in the kingdom of Anamurad, we see a beautiful palace. Rose, as she steps out of the carriage, runs toward her mother. The woman has a stern expression and doesn't seem overly excited about her daughter's return. She quickly scolds the girl, telling her that she shouldn't run while wearing a dress. Our protagonist also steps out of the carriage, thinking that he couldn't believe how bright the place was and that he had truly come from such a distant land. Looking at the Belnor family, the boy tells himself that no one here would recognize him. Izavo asks her husband if that was the child he had mentioned, and the man replies that yes, it was. He explains that it had been a long journey back, so they should go inside to finish the introductions, and Izavo agrees. All the servants begin unloading the family's luggage from the carriages and carry them into the palace. Later, we see the whole family gathered in a room with Boris. The matriarch finishes drinking her tea and tells Boris that she received a letter earlier, so she has a basic understanding of the situation, and you should feel comfortable here. Rose tells her mother that she always wanted an older brother, so she decided she would be the younger one. Her father laughs and asks Boris if they've grown that close already. Ganemon also says that while Boris is here, he should call him father and call Izavo mother. In addition, he must remember his new backstory. He is the youngest son of the Elbuvan family, the fallen lord of Vansk and the south of Travanches. He became the adopted son of Belnor at the age of 5 because their families were friends, and Boris has only received financial support from them, but grew up with his father after his mother passed away. After that, his father also passed away, so the boy came to the Belnor castle. After telling this fabricated story that our protagonist must memorize, Ganemon asks if the boy understood. He also adds that there are a few people in the castle who know a bit about Boris's situation. These include Hugh, the knight, and Willa, who cared for him when he was sick. Rose's maid, Camilla, and the people who were with the Count when he helped the boy also know part of the story. However, not even they know the full truth, and the only people who know everything are his wife and Rose. Finally, the Count tells Boris that he must respond to others according to what he just explained and asks if the boy understood. The only word that comes out of our protagonist's mouth is that he understood, and the boy thinks that while the story was made up, it had some similarities to his real life. The Count then orders his wife to prepare a room for Boris, as he thinks it's best not to have him far from Rose's room. Ganemon also mentions that he knows a perfect place for the boy, the second-floor room in the Tower of the Moon. Upon hearing this, Izavo seems slightly surprised. However, she quickly agrees, as it was the Count's order, and Rose wonders if her brother will really stay in that room. The patriarch adds that he will find an instructor to teach Boris swordsmanship, and until then the boy should rest and recover from the long journey. To conclude, Rose's father asks his daughter to show Jaemin the castle the next day, as the palace is large. and it's easy to get lost. Rose then suggests that Boris should have a servant, and her father proudly remarks that she is already thinking about her older brother's well-being. The Count affirms that he intended to introduce Boris to the servants in the morning, and he will let him choose someone he would like to have as a servant. Hearing this, Jaemin realizes that the man was genuinely treating him like a father, something he could barely remember happening in his own biological family. Later, in a room, we see our protagonist sitting on the floor in the corner of a wall. He sighs softly, thinking that he was finally alone. The boy recalls the moment when Rose said she would show him the room he would stay in the next day, but for today, he was to stay in the guest room. There, Boris reflects that the room was really nice and feels impressed by the infrastructure the Belnor family provides for visitors. He also remarks that he could see the path the carriage he traveled in had taken and wonders if they had traveled through forests. He muses, wanting to know if those forests were similar to the one where he used to play with his brother Yevgen. The young man has a few flashbacks, but quickly dismisses the idea, stating that there was no way the forest here could be similar, because in Travanches only grass and needles grew. In contrast, Anamarad was full of flowers, and the people here were warm and friendly. The boy says that this place is not his home, and that from that day on, he was in unfamiliar territory. Boris is startled awake by Rose, who asks if he's okay. The girl explains that her father asked her to show him around the castle. At first, she would show him where his room was. Rose also says that if Boris follows her without getting distracted and stays close, he won't get lost. Our protagonist remains silent, simply listening to Rose's explanation. As they walk, the young girl informs him that there are 4 towers around the Belmore castle, and the Moon Tower is to the south, where his room is located. After a short walk, the doors to a grand and beautiful hall open. Boris is greeted by an enormous, majestic room, and he asks if that's really where he'll be staying. Rose, delighted by his reaction, confirms it. Camille arrives, apologizing to Lady Rose, explaining that she had been busy and hadn't noticed that she had woken up. The blonde girl forgives her servant and states that she will be showing Boris around and wants Camille to follow them from a distance. Observing the situation, Jaemin recalls that he, too, had servants in Travanches, but they all felt like family, unlike the Belnor family's methods. After showing the massive room, Rose finally shows him where his comfortable bed is located. The girl also comments that some clothes have been hung in the wardrobe and that they'll teach Boris when to wear them. Rose explains to Boris that, excluding her parents' room, this is the best room in the castle, and she was supposed to have it when she turned 15. Therefore, she asks our protagonist to make sure to keep it clean while he uses it. Noticing this, the boy realizes that she already knows he will be leaving next year, but despite that, she is still acting very friendly. With that, Rose feels proud of herself as she believes she has finally established a good relationship with her new brother, even if only for a year. The tour of Boris's room continues, and on the balcony, Rose mentions that the room really has a good view, as the sunset is truly beautiful there. Next, she takes the boy to the kitchen, where she introduces him to the cooks. Afterward, they head to the dining hall, and Rose explains to Boris that they usually eat at a table near the kitchen because the dining hall is too large. After showing him all that, the girl thinks there's nothing else, but Camille reminds her of the library. Rose then explains that her father is probably visiting different areas of the country, so they can visit the library. The 2 children head there, and the blonde girl explains that there are tons of books in that place. Looking around, Boris quietly remarks that he knows well what a library is. Nevertheless, he rarely entered one as his father was always inside, and he thinks it's strange to miss his father, who had always been cold and distant. Perhaps it's because he can no longer see him. Rose suddenly shouts for someone named Lanzi, asking if he's reading the Count's book without permission again. The young lady scolds the poor boy, stating she couldn't believe he sneaked in again to read that book. She grows furious, slapping the servant's hand and asking how he dared to do such a thing. The princess also says the boy should know his place and demands to know what he was doing there. Rose places her finger on Lanzi's forehead and says she will tell her father about this and that the Count will keep a close eye on him. Witnessing this scene, Boris thinks he can't believe that servant sneaked into the library in the absence of his master. The poor white-haired boy apologizes to the young lady, admitting he was in the wrong. Analyzing the young servant, Jaemin thinks he has a different air about him compared to the other servants, and he is maintaining his composure even after being caught. The girl forgives the young boy, saying she will let it slide today because Boris is here, but if she catches Lanzi again, she will indeed tell her father. The white-haired boy bows, thanks the lady, and begins to leave. As he passes by Boris, the protagonist notices something odd about the boy's presence. Boris thinks that this young man didn't seem to be from Anamarad, just like him. After the tour, we see the Count and Boris standing before several servants. Jaemin introduces Boris of Belnor to the staff, stating that he has been his adopted son for 7 years. The Count explains that his son will be living in the castle from that day on, so he expects everyone to treat him with the same respect and care they show Rose. The Count also mentions that the boy will need a servant, so he asks Boris to choose someone. Lanzi and Boris exchange a few glances, and Boris already has something in mind. In his thoughts, Boris realizes he can't be certain what will happen or what mistakes he might make, so having someone around his age might be good. as they're likely to overlook certain situations. He also tells himself that someone a bit naive would be easier to deceive than someone intelligent, but he's curious about something. Boris wonders why he is so intrigued by the boy he met in the library, as he had a different aura compared to the other people there. The young man then tells his new father that he would like someone around his age. Ganimard, after thinking for a moment, informs Boris that the boy at the end of the line is named Lanzi, and he asks if his son wants that servant. The boy promptly agrees. Immediately, Ganimard calls Lanzi forward, and the young white-haired boy approaches his master. The small boy bows before Boris and introduces himself as Lanzi Rosencrantz. The Count then introduces Boris as the young master and instructs Lanzi to give his best while serving him. Lanzi simply agrees without showing any signs of dissatisfaction. Looking into the eyes of his new servant, Jaimin thinks the boy appears to be a simple servant, but he detects no hint of respect in his voice. And remembering how Rose reacted earlier, Boris thinks he understands why she behaved the way she did. Razin then tells Boris that he will take him to his room and mentions that there are a few things he wants to discuss with his master. Upon reaching the luxurious room, the white-haired boy asks Jaimin to sit down. Our protagonist, after sitting, mentions that he's a little thirsty, and Lanzi quickly serves him. After drinking the water, Boris places the glass on the table and asks what his servant wanted to tell him. Lanzi explains that he would first teach him about the Count's family. He then informs Boris that Master Ganimard patrols the country once every 10 days and travels to foreign lands every 2 months, with the duration of his trips being uncertain. Kranz also reports that Celtica is where the Count travels most often, and he also visits nearby territories to trade local spices. Lanzi further explains that although the master is generous to those around him, he isn't the type to easily forget someone who crosses the line. Upon hearing this, Boris thinks that the man values his people and his territory, but remains strict with them. The servant continues his explanation, informing Boris that the lady of the house usually stays on the property, waking early in the morning and going to bed early at night. She is the type to be offended by any mistake, no matter how small, and hearing this, Boris assumes this is likely a warning. The servant intended to speak about Lady Rose, but quickly states that Boris likely already knows what kind of person she is. Upon hearing this, Jaimin thinks that his servant probably couldn't be careless about what he says regarding Rose, especially after what happened in the library. The white-haired boy then informs Boris that the lady's birthday is next month and there will be many visitors from all over, including some from the capital. Most of the visitors will be from the Marquis Crezang family, which is Izawa's family, and the ladies who serve them will be the most important guests. He also mentions that there will be a ball during the event and finally asks if Boris knows how to dance. When hearing about the ball, Boris thinks that the only thing his family in Travanches knew was how to plan the eradication of one another, so there was no way anyone taught him to dance. Realizing that his master gave no answer, Lanzi assumes that Boris isn't familiar with this type of practice. With a gentle air, Lanzi offers to teach Boris if his master would like. However, Boris remains silent and time moves forward a bit. Our protagonist then asks his servant what kind of duties he performed in the castle before. Lanzi explains that he was assigned to handle the orders of Count Belnor and adds that he joined the family last year. With more curiosity, Boris asks where Lanzi lived before, and the servant tells him he came from Celtica. Upon hearing this, Jaimin reflects that Celtica is the capital of Anamarad, but still far from here, and wonders if his servant had been sold to become a servant of a noble family. He then asks if Lanzi's parents are still alive, but the boy lowers his head for a moment. Lanzi responds that he doesn't know for sure, but they were alive when he was sold, although he has no idea how they are doing now. Boris regrets asking that question and instead asks if Lanzi is alone now. However, the servant replies that he has a younger sister, so he's not entirely alone. He explains that the Count showed them compassion and his sister also lives in the castle with him. As night falls, Lanzi tells his young master that he would like to see his little sister. Boris agrees but says he would like to go with his servant. The white-haired boy, somewhat surprised, asks his master if he is a knight. Boris doesn't understand the question, but Lanzi quickly responds that he will believe his master is a knight. Soon after, we meet a beautiful girl with blonde hair named Lanzheim. Boris and Lanzi arrive at Lanzheim's room and her brother calls out to her. The girl, upon hearing him, turns while looking at the floor. Our protagonist notices that for some reason, Lanzheim is not looking in his direction. He thinks that Lanzheim seems like a fragile child, like a white tulip with a pale face and no expression, resembling more of a wax doll. Lanzi asks his master to sit on a chair for a moment. He then approaches his sister, holding her hand, and asks if the view outside looks better to her. The young man begins to gently caress his sister, asking if she saw the birds flying outside since they looked so beautiful. Cran starts to describe the birds, talking about their blue wings that glistened in the sunlight, saying he wishes he could show them to his sister for real. Watching this tender moment, Boris thinks he never imagined that Lanzi would have this side to him. He can't believe his servant is sharing all the good things that happened during the day with his sister, talking about how many beautiful things the world has to offer. Boris reflects that even though Kranz appeared cold and indifferent, he had things he found beautiful in his own way. In that moment, even though they were all in the same room, Boris feels as if Lanzi and his sister were in a distant world that only they shared. Lanzi stands and remarks that his sister seems to be in a good mood. He tells her it's not good to stay in the sun for too long and asks what she thinks about taking an afternoon nap, as she might dream of harvesting corn. Jaemin is confused by the situation, and hearing this peculiar language, he assumes it's some secret only the two siblings understand. Ruzin gently lifts his sister into his arms and places her onto the bed. The man gently lays the girl down, wishing her a good sleep and sweet dreams with a soft smile on his face. Soon after, that smile fades and he turns to his master, stating that they could leave now. A little later, we see Rose saying that she hated Lanzheim. Boris asks why, and the girl responds that Lanzheim seemed like an idiot. She asserts that she really hated people like Lanzheim because, although she can speak, she does nothing, and Rose continues to express disdain for the poor girl. Hearing this, Boris is surprised to learn that Lanzheim could speak and tells Rose that the girl didn't seem well. Rose agrees but adds that even so, Lanzheim is completely lazy. She explains that the only thing Lanzheim can't do is walk, as her legs are weak, but she doesn't even leave that room. Rose goes on, but Kamiya interrupts her, announcing that it's time for afternoon tea. Hearing this, Rose gets excited, mentioning that she needed to go because there would be ice cream cake today. Before leaving, she tells Boris that those two siblings need to learn to be more grateful, and despite his sister doing nothing, Lanzi treats her far too well. Finally, Rose comments that the Count has found Boris's fencing instructor, and she heard that the instructor would arrive tomorrow morning. The girl also mentions that her father said the instructor is very good, but a bit eccentric. She wonders if she should ask her father to let her learn fencing too, and hearing this, Boris wonders if she will be able to learn anything with her personality. Sometime later, we see our protagonist walking through a forest. The boy remarks that after staying in the house for a few days, he feels like his body has become stiff, and that the upcoming days will be tough with the training. While walking through the forest, Boris comes across a walnut tree and is impressed. He notices that the walnuts seem ripe and wonders if he should climb the tree. The boy hopes that climbing trees doesn't break any local etiquette and recalls how Yevgen used to let him climb on his shoulders to easily pick a bunch. However, suddenly several walnuts begin to fall in Boris' direction, and he turns, wondering if someone was there. He sees a figure and remarks that whatever it was moving very quickly, wondering if it was a mountain animal or a monster. However, a man with large hair calls out to Boris. The stranger says he saw the boy looking at the walnuts and thought he'd do him a little favor. Seeing that it was a human, Jaemin feels extremely relieved and soon starts laughing, commenting that he was foolish to think it was something else. More walnuts begin to fall in the boy's direction, and the man in the tree tells him to gather them all. The man climbs down from the tree, complaining that Boris didn't collect a single walnut. Hearing this, Boris wonders to himself who this shameless person could be. While stretching, the man tells Boris that he will help gather all the walnuts.